So, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at sports history, and I talked about this in a previous podcast, what is the greatest upset in the minds of NHL hockey fans? Well, the greatest upset didn't occur in one game, but it occurred because of one game. Of course, I'm talking about the infamous 1971 playoff series between Montreal and Boston, where the Canadiens entered a series as heavy underdogs to the outstanding Boston Bruin team of 1971 that had Busick and Esposito and Orr and Jerry Cheevers and the great forwards and defenders. Now, in 2019, the NHL doesn't have the what do you call the disparity like they did before. Any of the top 16 teams could go on a playoff run in any shape or form, and of course the Bruins this year have had a great playoff run, and they're going to be in the finals yet again for the 20th time. But for Boston fans, it's better not to mention to your face the debacle of 1971 against Montreal because, ladies and gentlemen, if this wasn't an upset, I don't know what you consider an upset. When the season ended, Montreal was on the verge of losing heavily in the first round. Now, Boston was playing a team in Montreal that failed to make the playoffs in 1970 for one of the few times of their dynasty eras. Now, Boston finished first that season with 121 points, and the Canadiens, even though they had a good season, were 24 points behind or 12 full games, with in third place with 97. Now, Montreal wasn't a weak team, but they were a team in transition because this was the season before Guy Lafleur arrived on the scene. There were rumors that 1971 Montreal was going to make changes, and Ferguson and Beliveau had hinted they were going to retire. Now, the Boston team they were facing was a tremendous offensive squad. Even though their defense could lack at times, it was the year that Bobby Orr had 100 points, but 100 points just in assists. He had 102 assists, and Esposito had 76 goals and 76 assists, 152 points in 78 games. This is a 2 point a game pace, and although it was a weak league with the six expansion times in what was then called the Western Conference, or the expansion conference, everybody thought that the Bruins winning the cup in 1970, they were loaded for a game, and they had no weak link. But what happened in Montreal that year was two major things that occurred. Frank Mahovlich ended up in a Montreal uniform to pair with his brother Peter in a late season trade with the Red Wings. And then Montreal called up former Cornell star Ken Dryden, who knew how to play in the Massachusetts style or the Boston Dryden style of hockey. Now, in two games late in the year, the Bruins did not face Dryden, and he was a surprise playoff starter because Vachon and Philip Muir were the main goalies that year. Now, a lot of the blame for the eventual loss in Game Two and the seven-game series, had to come down to two major factors. Some in the media think that Tom Johnson, the head coach of the Bruins, made a mistake with going with Eddie Johnston in Game Two after Cheevers really had a strong game in Game One. But this was a goalie rotation tandem for Boston. But for a lot of people, it was an error because it definitely Cheevers was the better goalie. Now, in Game Two, Montreal and there's the infamous Nesson breakdown the day after or 2 days after of what happened in the game, and it was totally bizarre because Boston at one point was leading 5-1 in the second period, and Montreal was pretty well out of it. But then the ghost of the form must have transferred by train from Montreal to Boston because it was just a heartbreaker. And Bobby Orr, of all people, was on the ice in majority of the comeback goals. Six straight that allowed Montreal to win 7-5. Now, Montreal opened the scoring very early in the first period. Yvan Cormier, who always played very well with his time with Beliveau, hit a strong counter at 3:32 to give Montreal that quick 1-0 lead. But then Orr opened up. He scored from Stanfield and McKenzie at 4:34 of the first. Then Teddy Green scored a very, very strong, not say half breakaway, but a good passing play in front of Dryden for them to go up 2-1 with a feed some Hodge and Esposito. And after the first period, Montreal was still in it, but, Boston was coming on. Now, in the second period, Montreal got into penalty trouble, and Boston made it 3-1 on a strong rebound shot with assists from Moore and Stanfield. And then Cashman, who always was big against Montreal, put Boston ahead 4-1 and at 6:31 and Esposito and Orr. And, as we were to per, then Cashman was always the open man for both these great teammates. And Dryden had made some key saves, but on these goals, I mean, Boston was using his offense the best way possible. And then at 8:41, Boston scored their fifth of the game, which a lot of people felt was the nail in Montreal's coffin, and with a tip shot by Sanderson from Orr and Eddie Westfall. Now, it's 5-1, 8:41 gone, and for the next 7 minutes, it's basically, the media's watching, we don't think anything's going to happen. We think Montreal is basically just playing it out and hoping for some momentum at home in Game 3. But of all people, this guy was money for Montreal for a year. Henri Richard at 15:33 took the puck and he used his pan to deke where he would protect the puck going towards the net. He scored to make it 5-2. But here's a legend of Henri Richard, ladies and gentlemen. There's been published reports that he went in the dressing room and he basically said, guys, we're not out of it. It's only 5-2. If we concentrate and score that first goal in the third period, we're going to make a comeback. And maybe the younger players like Sheen and Tardif and everybody else didn't believe it. But when Henri Richard spoke, people listened. And in the third period, again, like I talked about the ghost of the form, the big man, number 4, Jean Beliveau, really, really put the first nail in the coffin by scoring on 2:58 on the power play. And again, it was the reliable John Ferguson and Cornway that set it up. And but it's 5-3, and some people in the old Boston Garden were saying, just one goal. But then Beliveau 2 minutes later, 4:32 from again Cornway and Ferguson. Ferguson took out over the boards. And then Beliveau, as quick as he got the puck, put it in, beating Johnson on the 5-hole. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's 5-4. It's starting to get nervous. The next 5 minutes, things are going to happen, and something happened very quickly. My old interview pal, Jacques Lemaire, scored probably one of the biggest goals of his career at the 10-minute mark, unassisted when he intercepted a Ken Hodge pass to Bobby Orr. Went in and hit the shot around Johnson's right shoulder blade. And, the people in Canada were freaking out. The CBC, French and English reporters and announcers were just basically saying, what the hell is going on here? Boston had several opportunities to rebound, but a few minutes later, Ferguson again, another big goal for the big guy from Beliveau at 15:23. And Montreal was able to come back in the game because they're outworking Boston. I think Boston must have slightly underrated them. And of course, the big man, Frank Mahovlich, after McKenzie made a tough pass to Bobby Orr, Roberto pushed the puck ahead, and Mahovlich got a streaking. He took a slap shot from about, 25 feet, 20 feet, make it the final 7-5. But if you look at the whole breakdown of the game, Bobby Orr was on the ice for the majority of goals. Not that it was his mistake, but I think what Boston was pressing, and he didn't really understand Montreal's speed. Montreal had still some firework and hockey at the time. But if you have a team like Beliveau, Lemaire, Mahovlich, the two Mahovliches actually, and then the speed he had, Ferguson was deadly, Cornway was deadly. But as the series went on, Montreal went up 2-1 by winning 3-1 in Game 3. But then Boston even the series by winning 5-2 in Game 4. Came back to Boston. Boston won 7-3. Then Boston went back to Montreal and thought they were going to wrap them up. But Montreal opened out. Maybe they were sensing blood in the water and won 8-3 in Game 6. And then, of course, the big goal by J.C. Tremblay helped helped Montreal to a 4-2 win in the deciding Game 7. By the way, the upset was so intense that Sports Illustrated dedicated a cover to it. Very rarely would do that, and you know it is sort of like a legend of hockey that only a few people believed. If you saw the game live, you could believe it, but if you watch the highlights, it looks like a way to teach young players how to finish off, a broken play from their opponents, how to shoot the puck in. But you look at all the talent that scored. Every one of those key players from Montreal in the Hall of Fame. Okay, Ferguson, he was a very underrated player. He played with Beliveau. It was almost like members of a choir, like they joined together in voice. But it came down to it. When Beliveau was needed, when it was 5-2, he scored 2 goals. And Beliveau was a very skillful player, and there's a line that Dryden used and applies to his team and to the Russians. You never underestimate your opponent. Deep in their mind, because Boston had so much success in the regular season, they felt because they won the Cup in 1970, but they weren't playing the St. Louis Blues here. They were playing the Montreal Canadiens. And the Montreal Canadiens, if you woke them up like a great boxer or literally a great singer, they say the best singer at the bar is a drunk at the end of the bar when you wake him up and you ask him to sing George Jones. In this case, Montreal was ready to sing. Now, no matter what Boston does, or Boston has done since 1971, it's 48 years. You can't live this down. I'm glad that Boston's won cups. I'm glad Boston had success. But the old Boston curse that was over the Bruins for years, sure they won, and that applies to the Red Sox or wherever. It all derives from this game. This was a team, the Boston Bruins of 1971 could be considered a top 10 team in the history of the NHL. It's the greatest team to ever win a cup. It's the greatest sports team to never win a world championship or international championship. This would be comparable. The only thing I can compare it with is the 1972 Reds not winning the World Series against Oakland. Oakland overachieved. It'd be comparable to a Wayne Gretzky team losing in their prime, which they have done. But the problem is with the loss for the Kings. Loss of the Kings and the Islanders that Edmonton wasn't in their prime. The Calgary win in '86 could be comparable. But this was, again, this was a Boston Bruins team that was gaining fans, gaining recognition, and the loss, it's like waking up the old bear, and the bear swipes and knocks your head off and kills you. So if you have a chance, again, you can find the Nesson, or I think the WSBK, Boston, whatever Boston Channels was. The announcer basically warns the viewer who haven't seen the results or doesn't want to see them again. It's probably one of the best highlight packages to hear the Boston announcer forced to announce 6 straight goals by Montreal, knowing this was the biggest loss probably in Boston sports history before, ladies and gentlemen, before 1975 and before 1978 and before 86. Hockey is a very romantic sport, and here, if you were a Montreal fan in '71, and everybody was betting on Boston, can you imagine the smiles on your face the next day, going to work, and just seeing almost like the frustration in people's eyes? Even when I watch the game now, I still can't. I'm still amazed by it because Ken Dryden, he had his bad moments, but he overachieved so much as well. Kenny had some problem with certain players, like in Chicago and Boston, but right place, right time, the right type of players. And Montreal didn't have a good third or fourth line that year. And J.C. Tremblay was frustrated with the coaching of Al McNeil and, the Claude Roel influence. This was after Toe Blake had left, the team was, But if you're a Montreal fan, and if you're having frustration, it's always going to be there, the video. So again, it's on YouTube. Check it out and pass it to your friends. And if anybody's criticizing you by a Montreal fan, you tell them to call me at 272-1880, and I will direct them to the YouTube site that shows that, and I will basically tell them to their face or over the phone, to beat a man, you got to beat the man. In 1970, they didn't beat anybody. They bet St. Louis. Montreal wasn't there. They had an opportunity with that team to win 5 straight cups. I know they won in '72 and they lost in '74, but losing to Montreal destroyed any option of that Boston team being considered a dynasty, only a partial dynasty. You could have won 5 straight cups. Any team with Esposito and Orr and all those great players that they had through the lineup, through the years, Jerry Cheevers, to not do what they could have done is kind of, I still don't understand it. Anyway, that's just me. So on this beautiful Friday, where hopefully it'll stop raining today, we're going to have a warmer time coming. Have a great day, and as we like to say in the business, keep your stick in the ice. Bye.